Chapter 9. The Last Thylacine. The Future of Wildlife. The truth is, the natural world is changing, and we are totally dependent on that world. It provides our food, water, and air. It is the most precious thing we have, and we need to defend it. Sir David Attenborough. The novel Jurassic Park is the allegory I use to explain de-extinction. In that masterpiece by the late, great Michael Crichton, scientists recreated dinosaurs using other species to fill the gaps in the DNA they had managed to extract from the preserved guts of blood-sucking insects that were around at the same time as dinosaurs. In reality, any DNA extracted from such a sample is likely to be contaminated, and as such, dino DNA continues to elude us. Nevertheless, there are species closer to our current time that could do with being brought back first to help us re-establish carbon cycles in the Arctic and carbon sequestration, as well as ecological niches that were keystone species in their time, such as the woolly mammoth, the passenger pigeon, and the dodo. Interestingly, the only apex predator we are even close to bringing back from the dead is Australia's thylacine, otherwise known as the Tasmanian tiger. And even then, the size of the genetic pool of samples may be too small. The last captive thylacine, often referred to as Benjamin, lived at Hobart Zoo until its death on the night of 6 September 1936. Benjamin features in the last known footage of a living thylacine, 45 seconds of black and white video taken in 1933 by naturalist David Flay, showing the animal in its enclosure. In 2021, a digitally coloured 80-second clip of the footage was released by the National Film and Sound Archive of Australia to mark National Threatened Species Day. Benjamin is sadly believed to have died as the result of neglect. Locked out of its sheltered sleeping quarters, it was exposed to a rare occurrence of extreme Tasmanian weather, extreme heat during the day and freezing temperatures at night. His body was dumped in a garbage bin the next day. It wasn't deemed suitable as a museum exhibit. Official protection of the species by the Tasmanian government was introduced on the 10th of July 1936, 59 days before Benjamin died. The death was not reported in the media at the time, and the zoo expected that it would soon find a replacement. This, of course, never happened. Benjamin was the last thylacine. Australian scientists have mapped the genome of a thylacine preserved in ethanol, but a map is not the same as a functioning genome. So the next stage of research is to look at genome functionality while researchers wait for the time and tech needed to reproduce real genetic Tasmanian tigers. And that time is approaching fast, especially with the advent of CRISPR technology. CRISPR is a genetic engineering technique by which the genomes of living organisms can be cut at a desired location, allowing genes to be removed and new ones added. It can be used in the creation of new medicines, agricultural products, and genetically modified organisms, or as a means of controlling pathogens and pests. It also has possibilities in the treatment of inherited genetic diseases. The Tasmanian tiger has no extended family to speak of. It is a marsupial, not a dog or a wolf, so crossbreeding for some hybrid vigour would not work. The thylacine therefore remains elusive for now, out of sight, but not out of mind. But why would we want to play at being God and bring back animals that have gone extinct? Well, what were we doing when they were made extinct by humans in the first place? Rewilding could well restore wild places for biodiversity and also for the functions the ecosystems provide. Woolly mammoths, coral, and climate change. Bioscience firm Colossal has secured millions of dollars to bring back the woolly mammoth. Researchers say the mammoth shares 96% of its DNA with the Asian elephant, so it is likely that a new hybrid species will be created, the mammothant, and it will be as close to the real thing as possible. This de-extinct woolly mammoth will then be released on the Arctic grasslands to help restore that ecosystem and fight climate change through restoration of the carbon cycle, sequestering carbon via their feces at the same time. It sounds like a win-win to me. At least woolly mammoths aren't carnivores or dinosaurs, so the public attitude towards them is universally positive, plus the Ice Age movies help. The Lazarus Project in Australia successfully worked with the gastric brooding frog some 30 years after it was declared extinct. Embryos were created in the lab, and the scientific team is very grateful for the intact tissue that was somehow stashed at the back of a university freezer. Does this amount to cloning or rewriting DNA using CRISPR technology? People are paying some $50,000 to have their pets cloned in parts of the world that allow it, so how much should we pay to see extinct animals re-established in the wild? On the Great Barrier Reef, accelerated evolution has been employed. However, it is not without its critics. Corals that are particularly tolerant to changes in conditions such as temperature, pH, nutrient levels, or even salinity are grown in tanks and then on coral tables, and then planted in coral reef systems to grow alongside native species and help prevent the collapse of the coral systems and biodiversity. Coral is a really complex animal that on shallow tropical reefs operates in a state of ecological mutualism, where two or more species interact with benefits to both species, with algae. The algae uses photosynthesis to produce food for the coral, and the coral provides a clean, safe space for the algae. There are many mysteries surrounding coral biology. One question fascinating scientists is how corals know when to spawn. Over time, corals have learned about the moon stages and evolved to time their spawning to a certain number of days after the full moon. I still find the timings and rhythms of Mother Nature to be one of the most enthralling secrets of science that we are yet to fully grasp. Even in recent times, the reef has revealed some more secrets. A new reef was mapped by the RV Falkor, a research vessel operated by the Schmidt Ocean Institute, SOI. The SOI and other research teams are now able to live stream videos of their work back to the public. If you're ever needing a break, a trip into the deep ocean via the SOI's remotely operated vehicle as Sebastian is a great way to spend 10 minutes marvelling at places we will never be able to go. Following the wonderful work of Dr. Christina Kellogg of the US Geological Survey will lead you to the hunt for supercorals. These deep-sea corals are the great-grandparents of the shallow corals you'd be familiar with. They live some 200 metres down in the dark, so there are no algae partnerships there, and have a tolerance to temperature and pH that our shallow water corals may need in order for our tropical reefs to survive the effects of the climate emergency and the damage being caused directly by humans through agricultural runoff and upwelling. We need to find where these supercorals and deep-sea solutions are hiding. When deep-sea coral research teams applied standard models, they knew from all the data they had from coral research that they had completely missed entire deep-sea coral reef systems. The models were not adequate, to say the least. We have a huge imperative to map the ocean floor as soon as possible so we can protect what is there. A map of the ocean floor is planned to be completed by 2030, and there is a major international push for this via the Nippon Foundation JEBCO Seabed 2030 campaign. This campaign has been formally endorsed by the UN as part of the Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development 2021 to 2030. The timing for this is perfect, because this mapping is becoming more and more necessary in the face of seabed mining and other destructive practices such as trawling, which destroys habitats we can't see. One way to create an ecological map is through the use of a technique called environmental DNA, or eDNA. It's a whole genome analysis technique from the entire ecosystem, called community composition profiling. That is, working out what species are in the sample and then calculating the diversity of those species to determine ecosystem status. The eDNA sample can come from water, soil, air, or even snow. Even the tracks of endangered animals in the snow. And the point is to try and collect a more complete picture than just an individual species' behaviour. eDNA is a great way to get a pulse check on the genetic potential of an area. But, as with health, we should never have just one metric that we rely upon for conservation. eDNA doesn't tell us much about an ecosystem's function. The other issue with solely relying on eDNA is that it's not quantitative. Though some have tried to extrapolate and quantify it, it is usually well correlated in lab experiments but not in the natural world. We aren't there yet. Economics. How do we conserve ecosystem function, apex predators, and formerly extinct keystone species while facing the climate emergency and fighting against humanity's war on biodiversity? One approach is with economics. All ecosystem services performed by Mother Nature have an intrinsic financial value to humans. This is based on their benefit transfer values, what the services would be worth if we had to pay for them. While I can't give you a direct value of, say, a litre of river water in Scotland because we don't trade in river water, I can give you the value of the local salmon or whisky industry through traditional economics, and we can therefore translate that value to the ecosystem's service of providing clear, clean water for the distilleries and a healthy habitat to support the life cycle of the salmon. Having worked in a consultancy as an environmental economist for a couple of projects around the EU's Water Framework Directive, WFD, I can tell you how interesting it was to calculate the impacts on Mother Nature. The WFD has directives around controlled chemicals, beach water quality, and even shellfish water quality. It was also the first piece of environmental legislation to have economic levers and brakes built in. There was a cost-benefit analysis for restoring or protecting the last bastions of some endangered species, such as the freshwater pearl mussel in Ireland. Once we have a digital twin of planet Earth, we can then look at ecosystem functions on a global scale and start valuing natural assets and resources. This would provide a huge source of income for countries that are currently harbouring huge swathes of undeveloped wild landscapes and natural capital. What value do you put on a giant panda, a koala, or the Murray-Darling Basin? Now extrapolate that globally, and you'll find we're talking about a lot of money. Rewilding. We talk a lot about restoring habitats and recreating ecosystems, but because the climate crisis has already wrought change on a planetary scale, it is impossible to rewind time and re-establish environments that would have existed before the first industrial revolution or before the human population exploded. We are stuck in a space that can be described by niche theory. Let me explain. There are two niches to think of here, the fundamental niche and the realised niche. The fundamental niche effectively means all the different conditions organisms require in order to exist. In conservation, this may mean temperatures, food and water access, competition, basically everything that is a basic need to live. The realised niche is the one we choose to live in, or that is chosen for us. For example, some animals can cope with a lot of change and they adapt. A good example of this is wild animals that adapt well to urban life, such as raccoons in the USA or foxes in London. Effectively, their new living conditions still provide all they need to survive, even if it is not what their species' optimum conditions are. When we talk about rewilding, we are talking about re-establishing some form of ecosystem function that has been lost. For example, people wonder how the reintroduction of wolves into Scotland might help the population of freshwater pearl mussels. The answer lies in the balance of the niches. Wolves eat the deer, which reduces the deer population, so fewer deer trample the riverbanks, reducing the amount of sediment falling into the river. This means that the river may return to a more pristine habitat, therefore producing more food for salmon and allowing the salmon population to grow. The freshwater pearl mussels, whose life cycle is attached to that of the salmon, can then also start recovering as their niche is also restored to a survivable level. We have extensively monitored these environments through remote sensing, RS, and Earth observation, EO, using satellites such as NASA's Landsat, which you've probably heard of. This means we can follow our environmental progress, or lack thereof, by measuring change on a landscape scale over decades of data points. These satellites can track the sediment loads in rivers and estuaries, the oxygen and algae levels, and also the soil carbon measurements. We can use satellites to track fires, floods, and other extreme weather events, as well as for infrastructure impact assessments and town planning. The best use of this data starts with asking the right questions about the ecosystem you are reviving. The ecosystem services of this planet provide the very oxygen we breathe, but funding for conservation and environmental protection is lacking. There are things that are so obviously in need of funding, I am agog that we have no billionaires rushing towards these goals. For example, Whales are carbon sinks. They absorb more carbon from the atmosphere than they release. They literally carry the carbon up and down and across the ocean levels, fertilising low nutrient areas with their poo, and eventually their bodies drop to the ocean floor and take their carbon with them. The carbon sink value for whales is somewhere around $1 trillion. And yet we don't see any whale breeding programs happening. These creatures could actually save us from the climate emergency. Our bodies and our brains love to be around natural wilderness. There's even a term for it, forest bathing. We need green spaces and wild coastlines, and yet we seem to be fighting a war against the natural world. A war we are not going to win. The encroachment of humans into the forests and wild spaces of the planet has created and will continue to create global pandemics. We need to listen more to the natural world, create a digital twin of the ecosystem, and question and analyse the data at all levels and resolutions. By protecting Mother Nature, we may actually save ourselves. Get back in the driver's seat. One of the main issues with conservation programmes is that the non-governmental organisations, the NGOs, that run them have to raise funds, which is incredibly competitive. People like to donate to save large, majestic creatures such as whales or cute and fluffy animals like the giant panda or koala. Clever conservation organisations know this means that they have to translate the protection of keystone species into the protection of the ecosystem that exists to support the cuddlier creatures. Little funding goes to the conservation of a rare soil fungus. This is where you can come in and assist active conservation. Next time you need to buy a birthday present for someone who has everything, why not contribute a koala or a barramundi to them by supporting a grassroots conservation charity? Check out First Nations conservation charities where you live. Some 80% of wild places are under the control and management of Indigenous peoples, and they should be supported economically and socially for their work. If you're not sure or have no easy options near you, then check out well-known and globally vocal options such as the Nature Conservancy, or maybe throw some money at your local university's research and teaching. We all need Mother Nature more now than ever before. It is time to put our money where our hearts, minds and souls are.